Smack! The sound of the 80-page termination packet hitting the solid mahogany desk echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous, glass-walled executive office. It was a very heavy, very expensive-looking packet, printed on that thick, cream-colored cardstock that screams we paid a corporate law firm $700 an hour to legally ruin your life. I stared at the packet. Then, slowly, I dragged my gaze up to the two people sitting across from me. On the left was Julian, my boss, my CEO, my fiancé. He was leaning back in his absurdly oversized, ergonomic leather chair, looking down his perfectly symmetrical nose at me. He was wearing the bespoke navy Brioni suit I bought him for his birthday, his hair styled into that effortless, slightly messy sweep that took him exactly 45 minutes and 3 different premium pomades to achieve. He looked like he'd just conquered a small, wealthy nation and was currently deciding what to do with the peasants. On the right was Chloe, our director of human resources. And, as of 6 months ago, the woman Julian had been enthusiastically banging in hotel rooms on business trips that I had personally booked for him. She was wearing a blindingly white, tailored blazer and a smirk so sharp it could cut glass. Her perfectly manicured, blood-red acrylic nails tapped a staccato rhythm on the mahogany surface, right next to the termination papers. "Read it over, if you must," Julian said. His voice was smooth, practiced, and dripping with a patronizing sorrow that made my skin want to detach itself from my body and walk out of the room. "But I assure you it's all standard. We're exercising the Founder's Clause to reclaim your unvested equity. It's for the best, really. The company is pivoting, and your skill set just doesn't align with our new trajectory." My skill set. He meant the proprietary back-end financial algorithm I had spent 3 grueling, sleep-deprived years coding from scratch. The algorithm that was currently the sole reason his startup had just secured a $40 million Series B valuation. That skill set. In a normal, linear progression of time, this is the exact moment my entire world should have shattered into a million jagged, bloody pieces. This was the moment I was supposed to hyperventilate. The moment the betrayal was supposed to hit me like a freight train, crushing my lungs and blinding me with hot, desperate tears. I should be panicking. I should be screaming. I should be begging him to explain how the man who proposed to me in Paris last spring was currently firing me and stripping me of my life's work with his mistress sitting shotgun. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't feel my chest tighten. Instead, a bubble of hysterical, effervescent laughter built up in the back of my throat, so powerful and so sharp, I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep it from exploding out of my mouth. I felt incredible. I felt light. I felt an utter, hilarious, euphoric relief washing over me, humming in my veins like a triple shot of espresso. Why? Because I had a secret. A really, really good secret. Have you ever died? Let me tell you, 0 out of 10, I absolutely do not recommend it. Exactly 3 hours ago, I was dead. I mean literally dead. Heart stopped, brain dark, flatlined dead. In my past life, which ironically was just this morning, this exact meeting played out very, very differently. In that original, pathetic timeline, I didn't see the ambush coming. When that thick packet hit the desk, I completely fell apart. I wept, I begged, I demanded to know what I had done wrong. I grabbed Julian's hand across the desk, pleading with him to look at me, to remember us, to remember the nights we ate cold takeout on the floor of our first crappy apartment while I fixed his broken code. Julian hadn't cared. He had just looked at me with cold, reptilian disgust. Chloe had slid a pen across the desk and threatened to have security drag me out by my hair if I didn't sign the NDA and the equity forfeiture immediately. Blind with panic and grief, utterly shattered by the sudden loss of my fiancé, my job, and my company, I had signed. I signed away my life. I didn't know then that they weren't just firing me, they were setting me up. Julian and Chloe had been systematically embezzling investor funds for nearly a year, funneling millions into an offshore slush fund. By forcing me out and framing my subpar coding as the reason for financial irregularities, they made me the perfect, convenient scapegoat for the SEC. The next 2 years of that previous life were a waking nightmare. I was blacklisted from the tech industry. The feds dragged me through endless litigation. Julian's high-powered lawyers buried me in mountains of falsified evidence. I lost my apartment. I drained my meager savings on legal fees. I ended up living in a damp, moldy basement studio, working 3 minimum-wage remote jobs just to eat. And then, the stress finally won. A massive, sudden heart attack. I vividly remember the peeling yellow paint on the ceiling of the emergency room. I remember the frantic beeping of the monitor. I remember the crushing, suffocating weight in my chest. The terrifying realization that I was dying at 28, utterly alone, branded a criminal, while Julian and Chloe were probably sipping vintage champagne on a yacht in the Mediterranean. I remember the screen going black, and then I blinked. I took a massive, gasping breath, my lungs filling with crisp, air-conditioned oxygen, and my eyes snapped open. I wasn't in a hospital bed. I was sitting at my ergonomic chair, staring at my dual monitor setup. The date on the bottom right corner of my screen read August 6th, exactly the day of my firing. Exactly 3 hours before the 3 p.m. ambush in Julian's office. The universe, in an act of staggering, unprecedented comedic genius, had hit the rewind button. I had spent the first 20 minutes in a state of absolute shock, touching my face, feeling my racing pulse, pinching my arms until they bruised just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. But the code on my screen was real. The lukewarm break room coffee on my desk was real. I was reborn. I was back. And this time, I wasn't going to be the sacrificial lamb on the altar of Julian's greed. "Are you even listening to me?" Julian's sharp, irritated voice snapped me out of my reverie and back into the present moment. I blinked, refocusing my eyes on his perfectly punchable face. "Sorry," I said, my voice eerily calm, smooth as glass. "I was just admiring your suit. Brioni, right? Looks great on you. Really brings out the absolute void behind your eyes." Julian blinked, momentarily derailed. He frowned, a tiny crease appearing between his perfectly groomed eyebrows. This wasn't the script he had written in his head. He had anticipated hysterics. He had braced for a screaming match. He had absolutely not prepared for me to compliment his tailoring. Chloe cleared her throat loudly, adjusting her white blazer. "Let's keep this professional," she snapped, leaning forward like a predator, smelling blood. "This isn't a social call. This is a termination for cause. We are offering you a very generous severance package, 3 months of your base salary. In exchange, you will sign this non-disclosure agreement, waiving your right to speak about the company, its founders, or its proprietary technology in perpetuity. You will also sign the equity release, acknowledging that your shares were unvested due to performance issues." Performance issues. I let my eyes flick down to the papers. I didn't even need to read them. I knew every vicious, legally binding trap buried in that jargon. Performance issues. I repeated slowly, letting the words roll around in my mouth. I looked back up at Julian. Is that what we're calling it? Interesting. Because last quarter, my algorithm increased our processing efficiency by 400%. You literally bragged about it to Forbes. They put your face on the cover, remember? You framed it. It's hanging on the wall right behind you. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw clenching. The company is evolving, he repeated, falling back on his rehearsed corporate buzzwords. We need a different kind of visionary leadership on the back end. You're a great coder, yes, but you lack the overarching strategic mindset required for a C-suite role in a Series B enterprise. He folded his hands on the desk, leaning forward to deliver his finishing blow. This was the part where he was supposed to break me. Look, I know this is hard, Julian said, dropping his voice an octave to his sympathetic register. It was the same voice he used when he told me he was too busy with work to come to my mother's funeral last year. And I know our personal relationship complicates this, but you have to separate emotion from business. I have a fiduciary duty to the board. I can't let my feelings for you cloud my judgment. You're simply not the right fit for the company anymore. It's time for you to walk away. Cleanly. My feelings for you. I had to suppress a bark of genuine laughter. The audacity of this man was almost awe-inspiring. He was sitting next to the woman he was currently sleeping with, firing the woman he was engaged to, stealing millions of dollars, and lecturing me on fiduciary duty. It belonged in a museum. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic sociopathy. In my past life, those words had gutted me. They had confirmed my deepest, darkest insecurities, that I wasn't good enough, that I was just a stepping stone, that I was unlovable and replaceable. But now, looking at him, I didn't see a visionary CEO. I didn't see the love of my life. I saw a pathetic, greedy little boy in an expensive suit playing a game he didn't realize he had already lost. A clean break, I echoed softly. Exactly, Chloe chimed in, smelling victory. She tapped the pen against the signature line again. Tap, tap, tap. If you sign now, we will wire the severance to your account by the end of the week. You can pack your personal items, just the plants and photos, please. IT will need to wipe your laptop immediately and be out of the building by 4. If you refuse to sign, or if you decide to make a scene, she let the threat hang in the air, giving me a pitying, tight-lipped smile. Julian is fully prepared to file a lawsuit for corporate negligence based on the mismanagement of the back-end architecture. You'd be tied up in court for years. You'd never work in tech again. We're offering you a golden parachute. I highly suggest you pull the ripcord. There it was. The trap. The exact same trap that had ensnared me in the last timeline. Sign the NDA, take the paltry hush money, and unwittingly become the fall guy for their embezzlement when the feds eventually noticed the missing millions. Julian leaned back in his chair again, looking incredibly satisfied. He reached out and placed a hand over Chloe's, a blatant, deliberate show of disrespect, a visual confirmation of what I already knew. He was waiting for the tears. He was waiting for the begging. He was waiting for me to realize that I was completely, utterly powerless. I didn't break eye contact. Slowly, deliberately, I let a smile stretch across my face. It wasn't a brave, forced smile. It was a wide, terrifyingly genuine, teeth-baring grin. 3-month severance? I asked, my voice bright and cheerful. And you want my equity back? Julian's eyes narrowed. The smile was unsettling him. Yes, that is the offer on the table. It is non-negotiable. Oh, Julian, I sighed, leaning forward and resting my chin on my hands. I looked at him with the fond exasperation you might reserve for a toddler who had just proudly presented you with a piece of dog crap. You really think you're the smartest guy in the room, don't you? The silence in the office abruptly turned heavy. Chloe stopped tapping her pen. Julian's smug expression faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. "I don't know what kind of mental breakdown you're currently experiencing," Julian said coldly, his voice losing its polished sheen. "But I assure you, this is not a joke. Sign the papers." "I will," I said pleasantly. "I'll sign everything. I'll sign the NDA. I'll sign the equity release. I'll even sign a piece of paper declaring you the undisputed king of the douchebags if it makes you feel better. I'll pack my sad little succulents and I will walk out of those double glass doors, and you will never, ever have to look at my face again." Julian and Chloe exchanged a quick, uncertain glance. This was going entirely too smoothly. They knew I wasn't a pushover. They knew how much this company meant to me. "But," I continued, sitting back and crossing my legs, settling comfortably into the chair, "I have one tiny, teeny, microscopic little condition before I put my name on that dotted line." Chloe sneered, recovering her bravado. "You aren't in a position to negotiate anything. You have zero leverage." "Oh, sweetie," I laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that bounced off the glass walls. "I have all the leverage, because I know exactly what you two have been doing when the lights go out." Julian scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "If this is about Chloe and me, save it. Your personal jealousy has no bearing on a corporate termination." "I don't give a damn who you sleep with, Julian," I interrupted, dropping the cheerfulness and letting my voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "I'm talking about the Cayman Islands. I'm talking about the Tier 3 holding account." The air in the room instantly vanished. Julian froze, literally froze, like someone had hit pause on a remote control. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost comical, leaving him looking like a very handsome, very panicked ghost. Beside him, Chloe's jaw went slack. Her perfect white teeth parted in shock. They stared at me. I smiled back, utterly, blissfully unbothered. The ambush was over. The game had just begun. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that usually precedes a car crash. For a solid 10 seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the central air conditioning. I watched Julian's brain short-circuit in real time. It was a beautiful thing to witness. You have to understand, Julian was an ideas guy. He was the handsome face, the charismatic pitchman, the guy who could walk into a room of venture capitalists, flash his veneers, drop words like synergy, blockchain, and disruptive paradigm, and walk out with a $10 million check. He didn't build things. He didn't understand how things worked. He just knew how to sell the illusion that he did. And for 3 agonizing years, I had been the one sweating in the engine room, furiously shoveling coal to keep his illusion from falling apart. While Julian was out whining and dining investors at Michelin-starred steakhouses, taking networking trips to Aspen, and giving keynote speeches about the grueling grind of the startup founder lifestyle, I was the one actually doing the grinding. I spent 1,000 nights bathed in the harsh blue light of my dual monitors, surviving on stale pretzels and lukewarm instant coffee, writing the millions of lines of code that made up our proprietary financial algorithm. My back permanently ached. My vision blurred. I missed birthdays, holidays, and entirely skipped my 20s, all because I believed in the dream he sold me. I believed him. That was the truly pathetic part. When I finally finished the core architecture, a massive, elegant system capable of processing predictive market data faster than anything else on the market, Julian took me to Paris. He bought me a ring. He told me we were partners, in business and in life. But I was never a partner. I was a workhorse. I was the golden goose. And once the golden eggs started piling up, Julian realized he didn't need to keep the goose in the penthouse anymore. As the company's valuation skyrocketed, so did Julian's ego. He started showing up to the office in those ridiculous Brioni suits. He bought a Porsche. He started taking long, unexplained lunches. And then he hired Chloe. Chloe, with her MBA and her perfect blowout, whose primary contribution to the company seemed to be finding new and innovative ways to agree with everything Julian said. I had suspected they were sleeping together for months in my past life, but I had buried the suspicion deep down under a mountain of code and denial. I had convinced myself that I was just being paranoid, that the long hours were making me crazy. But the cheating wasn't even the worst of it. The cheating I could have survived. It was the theft. In my previous life, I didn't find out about the Cayman Islands account until the FBI was literally kicking down the door of my moldy basement apartment. By then, it was too late. During the discovery phase of my criminal trial, my overworked public defender had slid a stack of bank records across a metal table, finally showing me the truth. While I had been obsessively optimizing our back end to save the company fractions of a cent on processing fees, Julian had been systematically skimming off the top. Every time a new round of funding came in, a percentage quietly vanished into a labyrinth of shell companies, eventually landing in an untraceable Tier 3 holding account in the Caymans. He used my algorithm, the beautiful, complex system I had built to revolutionize the industry, as a smokescreen to hide his embezzlement. When the board of directors started asking questions about the missing capital, Julian and Chloe panicked. They needed a fall guy. They needed someone with the technical access to have supposedly committed the fraud and the lack of social capital to defend themselves. They needed me. They fired me, framed me, and watched me burn to the ground to keep their own hands warm. I died choking on the injustice of it all, my final thoughts consumed by a blinding, venomous hatred for the man I had once loved. But then, the universe blinked. I woke up. I remember the exact moment I snapped back into my body earlier today. 1 second, I was flatlining in a sterile hospital room, and the next, I was gasping for air at my office desk. My lungs burned. My hands shook so violently I knocked my lukewarm coffee over, sending a brown puddle creeping toward my keyboard. I stared at the date on my primary monitor. August 6th, 12 p.m., 3 hours before the ambush. It took me 20 minutes of frantic hyperventilating in a bathroom stall to accept that I wasn't experiencing a prolonged, oxygen-deprived death hallucination. The cold porcelain of the sink felt real. The splash of water on my face felt real. The sheer, unadulterated rage boiling in my gut felt very real. When I finally walked back to my desk, the terror was gone, replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused clarity. I didn't just have a second chance at life, I had a 3-hour head start on my own murder. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, cracked my knuckles, and went to work. If Julian wanted to play games with my life, I was going to rewrite the rules. He thought he was a mastermind, a slick corporate pirate getting away with the perfect crime. But Julian's fatal flaw was his sheer, staggering ignorance of the technology that actually ran his company. He didn't know that 2 weeks ago, the board of directors, growing increasingly suspicious of his flashy spending, had quietly mandated the installation of a highly sensitive, third-party auditing software on all executive-level financial nodes. It was a silent alarm system, designed to monitor liquidity and flag massive irregularities. Julian, naturally, had completely ignored the memo, assuming it was just boring 8 compliance jargon. I, however, had read the documentation. For the next 2 hours, while Julian and Chloe were likely in his office giggling over the termination packet they were about to drop on me, I was buried deep in the server backend. My fingers flew across the keyboard, writing lines of code with a manic, vengeful precision. I didn't just want to stop them from firing me. That wasn't enough. Surviving wasn't enough. I wanted absolute scorched earth biblical destruction. I wanted to build a trap so perfectly engineered, so dripping with poetic justice, that they would have to pull the trigger on themselves. I found the auditing software's master directory. I bypassed the security protocols, which was laughably easy, considering I was the one who had built the company's firewall in the first place, and I started injecting my own custom script into the root logic. The Cayman Slush Fund was hidden, off the books, entirely disconnected from our standard payroll and vendor accounts. Julian thought it was a ghost, but digital ghosts still leave footprints if you know how to look for the thermal radiation. I wrote a highly specific, maliciously compliant, conditional trigger. If any transaction exceeding $10,000 originates from the Cayman Tier 3 holding account, identifying it by its specific routing hash, and if the destination of that transaction is a registered employee bank account, then execute protocol Burn It Down. Protocol Burn It Down was a masterpiece. I linked the trigger directly to the shadow ledger I had uncovered in my past life's legal discovery. The moment the condition was met, the auditing software wouldn't just send a polite red flag to the compliance officer. It would violently, irreversibly compile the entire, unredacted history of the slush fund. Every stolen dollar, every fake invoice, every wire transfer to Chloe's personal consulting LLC, every receipt for Julian's Brioni suits and Aspen ski chalets. And then it would automatically blast that compiled dossier to the private, encrypted inboxes of every single member of the board of directors, the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. I even added an automated subject line in all caps: Urgent Financial Fraud Audit. Internal embezzlement detected. It was a dead man's switch, wired directly to Julian's greed. The beauty of the trap was its irony. I knew exactly what Julian was going to offer me at 3 p.m. 3 months severance. A golden parachute to keep me quiet. At my current salary, 3 months severance equaled exactly $15,000. All I had to do was make sure the money came from the right place. I finished writing the script at 2:45 p.m. I compiled it, ran a silent diagnostic, and embedded it deep within the auditing software's kernel, masking it as a routine background update. Then, I cleared my cache, wiped my terminal history, and locked my computer. I had walked into Julian's office at exactly 3 p.m. feeling like a god holding a lightning bolt behind my back. And now, staring at Julian's pale, trembling face, I knew the lightning was about to strike. The what? Julian finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking like a pubescent teenager's. The smooth, arrogant veneer had completely shattered. He looked frantically at Chloe, as if she might suddenly pull a magical HR policy out of her blazer that could save him. The Cayman account, Julian, I repeated slowly, speaking to him as if he were very, very stupid. The slush fund, the shadow ledger, the giant pile of investor capital you've been funneling offshore for the last 11 months to pay for your sports cars and Chloe's exorbitant bonus structure. You're insane, Chloe spat, though her voice shook violently. She gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, her knuckles turning stark white. That is defamation. You have no proof of anything. You're just a bitter, hysterical ex making up wild accusations because you can't handle getting fired. Defamation implies the statement is false, Chloe, I smiled, leaning forward. And we all know it isn't. You guys really thought I wouldn't notice? I built the entire financial infrastructure of this company from the ground up. You're routing millions of dollars through shell corporations using a network I designed. Did you honestly believe I wouldn't eventually see the data packets bouncing off an offshore server? Give me some credit. Julian swallowed audibly. He looked like he was going to be sick. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie, his breathing shallow and rapid. "What do you want?" he whispered. The patronizing tone was gone. The fake sympathy was gone. There was only raw, naked terror. He was doing the math in his head. He knew that if I went to the board right now, without an NDA, he was finished. The startup would collapse, the investors would sue him into oblivion, and he would go to federal prison. He was cornered. And a cornered rat will always try to buy its way out. "I told you what I want," I said smoothly, gesturing to the termination packet. "I want my severance. 3 months' pay. $15,000. I'm just adjusting the terms." Julian stared at me, his eyes wide. "You're blackmailing me." "I am negotiating," I corrected cheerfully. "You want my silence. You want me to sign this ironclad NDA and walk away forever, taking the fall for your performance issues so you can keep running this scam. Fine. I will sell you my silence. But I don't want the money coming from standard payroll. Standard payroll has a paper trail. Standard payroll means I'm officially severed from the company ledger." I leaned closer, dropping my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I want the money wired directly from the Cayman holding account, today, right now. If I'm going to be complicit in your little secret, I want the payout coming from the secret stash. It's a matter of principle." Julian blinked. I could almost see the rusted gears turning in his head. He was evaluating the risk. To authorize a wire from the slush fund directly to an employee's bank account was a massive breach of his own protocol. It was messy. It was leaving a footprint. But in his arrogant, technologically illiterate mind, he thought the account was invisible to the board. He thought the only threat was me. If he paid me from the standard payroll, I was just a disgruntled ex-employee. But if he paid me from the slush fund, he was proving to me that he had the money. And more importantly, he was buying my complicity. He thought that by taking the dirty money, I was getting my hands dirty too, ensuring I could never go to the authorities without implicating myself. He thought he was outsmarting me. "Julian, no!" Chloe hissed, her survival instincts kicking in. She grabbed his arm. "Don't log into that account on the company network. It's too risky. We can call security. We can throw her out. She doesn't have any hard evidence." Julian shook her off, his eyes locked on mine. He was sweating now, small beads of perspiration forming on his perfectly pomaded forehead. "If I do this," Julian said, his voice low and tight, "if I wire the funds right now, you sign the NDA. You sign the equity release. You take your things and you never, ever contact anyone in this company again. I will literally forget you exist," I promised, crossing my heart with a finger. Julian stared at me for 3 long, agonizing seconds. Then, he turned to his laptop. "Gotcha." I watched, practically vibrating with suppressed glee, as he frantically minimized the termination documents on his screen and opened a secure, encrypted browser window. I watched his fingers fly across the keyboard, typing in his credentials. I almost laughed out loud. He was using the same password he always used. Brioni, Boss 2024. The absolute lack of imagination was staggering. "Julian, this is a mistake," Chloe pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. She was hovering over his shoulder, watching the screen as the offshore portal loaded. "If the board sees a direct wire transfer, the board doesn't know this account exists," Julian snapped at her, his composure entirely fractured. "She's bluffing about the data packets. She's just guessing. If I pay her off, she signs the NDA and we're safe. I'm not letting her blow up a $40 million valuation over 15 grand. He navigated to the wire transfer portal. He typed in my routing number and my checking account number. He typed in the amount. $15,000. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. The trap was set. The bait was taken. All he had to do was pull the lever. "Are you sure you want to do this, Julian?" I asked, my voice dripping with mock concern. I mean, paying an employee out of an illegal offshore embezzlement fund is a pretty bold strategic move for a Series B founder. Does Forbes know about this leadership style? Shut up, he growled, his finger hovering over the trackpad. Just shut up and get your pen ready. He clicked authorize. The loading icon spun on his screen for 2 agonizing seconds. Then a green check mark appeared. Transfer successful. A half-second later, my phone, sitting face up on the mahogany desk, buzzed violently. A push notification from my banking app lit up the screen. Incoming wire transfer. $15,000. The money had left the Cayman account. The condition had been met. The dead man's switch was officially live. Deep in the company's server room, the auditing software I had hijacked was already compiling the ledger. The countdown to absolute zero had begun. Julian let out a massive, shaky breath, slumping back in his ergonomic chair. He looked exhausted, like a man who had just narrowly avoided being hit by a train, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing on the tracks of an oncoming freightliner. He slid the termination packet toward me, tapping the signature line with a trembling finger. "Sign," he demanded, a hint of his old arrogance creeping back into his voice. "You got your money. Now sign the NDA and get out." I picked up the heavy, expensive fountain pen. I didn't hesitate. I slashed my signature across the NDA, the equity release, and every other piece of legal garbage they had put in front of me. I signed them all with a flamboyant, sweeping cursive, pressing so hard the ink bled through the thick cardstock. Because the beautiful truth about non-disclosure agreements, a truth Julian's expensive corporate lawyers had apparently forgotten to explain to him, is that they are entirely, legally void the moment they are used to cover up a felony. I wasn't bound to silence. I was bound to the front row seat of his impending destruction. I threw the pen onto the desk. It clattered loudly, rolling off the edge and landing on the plush carpet. I stood up, smoothing the front of my skirt. I felt 10 feet tall. "Pleasure doing business with you, Julian," I said, offering him a bright, blinding smile. "Chloe, have a fantastic afternoon." I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy glass door. "Wait," Julian called out, his voice sharp. "Your things, your plants, your coffee mug." I paused with my hand on the stainless steel handle. I looked back at them. They looked so small, sitting behind that massive desk, clutching their signed papers like a shield. "Keep them," I said lightly. "You're going to need something to liven up the place. I hear federal prison is incredibly drab." I pushed the door open and walked out into the bullpen, not looking back. The bullpen was a hive of synthetic productivity, a meticulously curated open-concept workspace designed to look collaborative, while actually just stripping away everyone's privacy. As I walked out of Julian's office, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind me, the familiar symphony of startup life washed over me. The frantic clacking of mechanical keyboards, the hum of the espresso machine in the break room, the muffled voices of the sales team aggressively pitching our revolutionary synergy over Zoom calls. None of them looked up. None of them knew that the ground beneath their ergonomic standing desks had just evaporated. I walked down the main aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. I passed the engineering pod. My pod. The team of junior developers I had personally hired, trained and mentored. A few of them threw me quick, nervous glances, quickly looking back at their monitors. They knew something was wrong. You don't get called into the glass box with the CEO and HR on a Thursday afternoon for a promotion. But they didn't say anything. Self-preservation is the first instinct you learn in a tech startup. I didn't blame them. In my past life, their silence had broken my heart. I had felt so utterly abandoned, realizing that the culture of family Julian constantly preached was just a weaponized HR tactic to guilt us into working 60-hour weeks, But today, their silence was just background noise. I didn't need their defense. I had already defended myself. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the down button. The metal doors slid open instantly, as if the building itself was eager to spit me out. I stepped inside, hit the button for the lobby, and watched the numbers count down. 40, 39, 38. As the elevator plummeted toward the earth, I leaned against the cool, mirrored wall and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 years. Weaponized, malicious compliance. It is, without a doubt, the most exquisite flavor of revenge in existence. Julian thought he was an absolute genius. He thought his little negotiation in there was a masterclass in corporate hardball. He genuinely believed that by leveraging my desperation, he had forced me to accept a dirty payout, effectively shackling me to his crimes. He thought the non-disclosure agreement was an impenetrable magic shield. What Julian's incredibly expensive, Ivy League-educated lawyers had failed to hammer into his pomade-soaked head was a little legal concept known as the clean hands doctrine, combined with the absolute fragility of contracts used to conceal federal felonies. An NDA cannot legally bind you to cover up a crime. It is null and void the millisecond it is weaponized to obstruct justice. By forcing me to accept my severance from the Cayman Islands slush fund, Julian hadn't bought my silence. He had just committed wire fraud across international lines, directly linking his illegal offshore embezzlement operation to the company's internal payroll network. He had built the bridge for the feds, painted it neon yellow, and lit it on fire. The elevator dinged at the lobby level. I strolled past the marble security desk, giving a cheerful wave to Marcus, the night guard who was just coming on shift. "Have a good evening, Marcus," I called out. "You too, boss," he smiled back. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the blinding, oppressive heat of an August afternoon in the city. The sudden wave of humidity felt fantastic. It felt like breathing for the very first time. Directly across the street from our gleaming corporate tower was a small, overpriced artisanal coffee shop. It was the kind of place that charged $8 for a latte and served it in a mason jar, a place I usually avoided out of sheer principle. Today, however, it was the most important tactical outpost in the city. It had massive, floor-to-ceiling plate glass windows that offered an unobstructed, high-definition view of Julian's office building. I crossed the street, dodging a pissed-off cab driver, and pushed into the aggressively air-conditioned cafe. "Welcome in," the barista droned, looking up from her phone. "What can I get you?" "I would like your largest, most ungodly, expensive iced caramel macchiato," I said, sliding my credit card across the counter. "Extra caramel, extra espresso. I am celebrating." "Oh yeah? New job?" she asked, punching the order into the tablet. "Nope." I smiled, my teeth flashing. "I just got fired." The barista paused, giving me a long, incredibly confused look. Okay. Congratulations?" "Thank you. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me." I took my mason jar of liquid sugar and caffeine and claimed the prime corner table right by the window. I set my phone down face up on the reclaimed wood table, pulled my laptop out of my bag, and flipped it open. I wasn't hacking back into the system. That part of the job was done. My fingerprints were scrubbed, my entry point was wiped, and the script I had injected was entirely autonomous. I just wanted to watch the dashboard. I wanted to see the exact mechanical breakdown of Julian's hubris. I pulled up a secure, encrypted terminal window, a backdoor monitoring tool I had built years ago to keep an eye on server health, completely untraceable to the main network. The transaction had already cleared the Cayman server. $15,000. It was a pathetic amount of money in the grand scheme of Julian's theft, a rounding error on his stolen balance sheet. But it was the trigger. 15 to 14:22 EST. Incoming wire detected on subnet 4. 15-14-24 EST. Routing hash identified. CYM 7734 alpha. 15-14-25 EST. Destination verified. Employee payroll registry. ID 04992. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my macchiato. The caramel was perfectly burnt, sweet and cold. It tasted like absolute victory. On my screen, the silent auditing software woke up. It was a beautiful piece of code, really. The firm the board had hired to install it had done a sloppy job, leaving the primary logic gates wide open for anyone with administrative access to tinker with. When Julian hit authorize on that wire transfer, he didn't just send me money. He essentially tripped a digital tripwire connected to a payload of C4. 15-14-28 EST. Conditional parameter met. Executing override script. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand, my eyes glued to the terminal. In the company server room, 3 floors below Julian's office, the auditing software was currently ripping through the shadow ledger. It was bypassing the standard encrypted walls, using the very administrative credentials Julian had typed in to send me my severance. It was pulling everything. It pulled the initial seed transfers from the Series A funding round, perfectly matching the dates Julian had claimed we were restructuring operational costs. It pulled the wire transfers to the offshore shell companies. It pulled the invoices from Chloe's fake consulting firm, detailing the hundreds of thousands of dollars she was paid for HR synergy assessments that never actually existed. It pulled the routing numbers, the IP addresses of the logins, the timestamps, and the digital signatures. 15-15-01 EST. Data compilation complete. File size 4.2 GB. 4.2 gigabytes of pure, unadulterated, irrefutable corporate treason. Julian thought he was the smartest guy in the room because he knew how to manipulate people. He knew how to look a venture capitalist in the eye and lie without blinking. He knew how to make me feel small, how to make Chloe feel important, how to keep everyone dancing on his strings. But code doesn't care about your Brioni suit. Code doesn't care about your charisma or your manipulative charm. Code is absolute. Code is a mirror that only reflects the exact logic you feed into it. Julian had fed it poison, and now the system was aggressively regurgitating it directly onto the laps of the people who held his fate in their hands of 15-15-05 EST. Initiating external communications protocol. This was it, the climax, the point of no return. I watched the terminal as the auditing software generated the emails. It didn't just send an alert. It sent the entire 4.2 gigabyte compiled dossier as a secure, encrypted download link, bypassing the company's outgoing email filters completely. 15-15-08 EST. Outbound transmission 1-14. Board Chair Evans external.com. Success. 15-15-09 EST. Outbound transmission 2-14. Board Director Chen at external. Success. 15-15-10 EST. Outbound transmission 3-14. SEC Region 2. Enforcement Tipline at SEC.gov. Success. 15-15-11 EST. Outbound transmission 4-14. IRS CID Fraud Division IRS.gov. Success. I sat back in my chair and closed the laptop. The terminal went dark. My part was over. The algorithm had taken the wheel. I looked out the window, across the street, up to the 40th floor of the glass tower. From this distance, the windows were just dark, mirrored rectangles reflecting the afternoon sun. I couldn't see Julian. I couldn't see Chloe. But I knew exactly what was happening in that building. Board Chairman Evans was a notoriously ruthless, old-school venture capitalist who checked his email obsessively. He had a zero-tolerance policy for founders who messed with his money. The SEC regional office had automated scrapers that flagged the word embezzlement from verified corporate domains instantly. The clock ticked. 1 minute passed. Then 2. I took another sip of my coffee, savoring the icy sweetness. The cafe around me hummed with normal everyday life. 2 college students were arguing about a group project. A businessman in a wrinkled suit was furiously typing on his phone. None of them had any idea that a multi-million-dollar corporate empire was currently disintegrating into ash just 200 yards away. At exactly 3:19 p.m., the surface of the glass tower shattered. Not literally, of course, but the illusion did. The first sign was the security guards in the lobby. Through the glass doors, I could see Marcus, the guard I had just waved to, suddenly stand up from his desk, his hand pressing into his earpiece. Another guard sprinted across the lobby floor, pointing toward the elevator banks. A moment later, my phone lit up on the table, vibrating so violently it practically buzzed right off the reclaimed wood. It was an automated SMS blast from the company's emergency notification system. Urgent. All employees. The building is currently under mandatory lockdown protocol. All external network access has been suspended. Please remain at your desks until further notice. Do not attempt to leave the premises. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was happening even faster than I had anticipated. The board must have called their internal crisis management team the second they opened that ledger. Suspending the external network was step 1 in securing digital evidence. They were locking the doors to make sure Julian couldn't run, and they were cutting the internet to make sure he couldn't delete anything else. Not that it mattered. The auditing software had already sent the only copy they needed. Outside, the street began to change. The usual flow of yellow cabs and delivery trucks was abruptly interrupted by the screech of heavy tires. 3 sleek, black, unmarked SUVs swerved aggressively into the bus lane directly in front of the corporate tower. The doors burst open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Men and women in dark windbreakers, the unmistakable, terrifying uniform of federal agents, spilled out onto the pavement. They didn't walk. They marched. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying purpose, flashing badges at Marcus before bypassing the security turnstiles completely and swarming the elevator banks. "Holy crap," the barista whispered, pausing her wiping of the espresso machine to stare out the window. "Are those the feds? What is going on over there?" "Looks like an audit," I said mildly, stirring my macchiato with my straw. "Those can get pretty intense." My phone started ringing. The caller ID flashed on the screen, a massive, high-definition photo of Julian smiling his perfect, veneered smile at a gala event I had organized for him. The irony was so thick I could practically chew it. I let it ring. I watched the screen flash. Julian calling. Julian calling. I took a deep breath, letting the sheer, unadulterated power of the moment wash over me. In my past life, this man had dictated my self-worth. He had controlled my time, my emotions, my finances, and ultimately my death. He had reduced me to a terrified, weeping mess on his office floor. Now he was just a desperate, trapped animal hammering on a glass wall, begging for a way out. The phone stopped ringing. A second later, it started again. He was frantic. I picked it up on the 3rd ring, swiped right, and lifted it to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice dripping with bright customer service cheerfulness. "You have reached the newly unemployed and entirely unbothered. How can I direct your call?" "What did you do?" Julian's voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't the smooth, practiced baritone of a visionary CEO. It was a high, thin shriek, cracking with absolute panic. It sounded like he was hyperventilating. I could hear chaotic background noise, alarms blaring in the distance, doors slamming, and someone, presumably Chloe, sobbing hysterically. "What do you mean, Julian?" I asked innocently. "I'm just sitting here enjoying a lovely iced coffee. I bought it with my severance, actually. Thanks for that, by the way. The wire cleared perfectly." "The board!" he screamed, his voice breaking entirely. "Evans just called me. He was screaming. The auditors are here. There are literally federal agents in the lobby right now, shutting down the elevators. They have everything. Every single transaction, every offshore account, the fake invoices. How did they get it? You did this. You hacked the system." "Oh, Julian," I sighed, clicking my tongue in mock sympathy. "I didn't hack anything. I don't even have an active keycard anymore, remember? You fired me for performance issues." "Don't play games with me," he roared, though the roar sounded more like a desperate sob. "You set me up. You forced me to use that account. You knew this would happen. I'll tell them it was you. I'll tell them you wrote the algorithm. You manipulated the ledgers. You forced me to sign that wire transfer." "I forced you?" I interrupted, letting a sharp, cold edge bleed into my voice. "Julian, honey, do you hear yourself? I didn't put a gun to your head. I didn't type in your painfully basic password. Brioni Boss 2024, really? You should be embarrassed. I didn't make you steal millions of dollars from your investors, and I certainly didn't make you authorize a $15,000 wire fraud to silence an employee." "You signed an NDA," he shrieked, grasping at the only lifeline he thought he had left. "I have your signature on an ironclad legal document. If you talk to the feds, I will sue you into the ground. I will ruin your life." "An NDA doesn't cover federal crimes, you absolute moron," I said softly. The cheerfulness was gone. I wanted him to hear the ice in my voice. I wanted him to hear the ghost of the woman he had killed in another timeline, finally coming to collect. "And I don't need to talk to the feds. I don't need to say a single word. You literally just paid me off using stolen investor funds, establishing a direct, undeniable, federally time-stamped paper trail of your own embezzlement. You didn't just confess, Julian. You provided the receipts." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. For a brief, beautiful moment, I could hear the exact moment his brain caught up to his reality. I could hear the walls of his massive, fragile ego collapsing inward, crushing him under the weight of his own arrogance. He had thought he was outsmarting me. He thought he was playing 4D chess. He didn't realize until this exact second that I owned the board, the pieces, and the table they were sitting on. Julian choked out. Chloe, get off the floor. Call legal. Tell them, no, wait, get away from me. Don't touch those files." The sound of his panic was the greatest symphony I had ever heard. It was Beethoven's Ninth, played on the strings of a ruined tech bro. "Well, it sounds like you have a very busy afternoon ahead of you," I said casually, taking another sip of my coffee. "I'd love to stay on the line and listen to you get handcuffed, but I have a lot of free time on my hands now. I think I might go car shopping. Maybe look at some luxury campers. With my new Severance, of course. Best of luck with the minimum security facility, Julian. Try not to drop the artisanal soap. You bitch, I swear to God I'll—" I pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the red button, and hung up. I navigated to his contact profile, clicked block caller, and tossed the phone back onto the table. Across the street, the scene was escalating perfectly. Through the massive glass windows of the lobby, I could see a swarm of agents marching toward the security turnstiles. I watched as they moved with brutal, unquestionable authority, commandeering the elevators and locking down the exits. Julian's reign was over. The empire he built on my back was currently being dismantled, brick by stolen brick. And he had lit the fuse himself. I leaned back against the plush booth of the coffee shop, the cold condensation of the mason jar chilling my fingers. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of roasted coffee beans and victory. I was 28 years old. I had $15,000 of clean, untraceable severance sitting in my checking account. I was free of a toxic relationship, free of a soul-crushing job, and free from the terrifying, tragic fate of my past life. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly still, perfectly calm. I let them fire me on the spot. I let them think they had won. And in doing so, I had burned their entire world to the ground. I picked up my coffee, raised it in a silent toast to the federal agents storming the 40th floor, and took a long, satisfying sip. Rebirth really was a beautiful thing. The neon sign of the artisanal coffee shop hummed a low, erratic drone, casting a sickly green tint over the reclaimed wood of my table. Outside, the late afternoon sky was bleeding a bruised purple and burnt orange, the kind of dramatic sunset that usually looks great on Instagram, and terrible for anyone trying to drive through downtown traffic. For me, it looked like the opening credits of an action movie where the hero walks away from a massive explosion in slow motion, refusing to look back at the fireball. I checked my watch. 3:45 p.m. 45 minutes. That was all it took for a $40 million tech startup to completely dissolve into a puddle of administrative goop. If you mapped out the exact chronological sequence of what was happening behind those tinted, double-paned glass windows across the street, it read like a textbook on how not to commit white-collar crime. I should know. I had spent the last 2 hours writing the textbook, printing it out in binary code, and duct-taping it to a digital brick. Let's break it down, shall we? At exactly 3:14 p.m., Julian Vance, visionary CEO, tech bro extraordinaire, and my cheating ex-fiancé, had smugly hit authorize on his laptop keyboard. His fingers, weighted down by an ego the size of Texas and zero technical comprehension, pushed $15,000 of embezzled investor capital straight from the offshore Cayman Islands Tier 3 holding account into my personal checking account. That was step 1. The match. Step 2. The spark. The second that transaction cleared the offshore gateway, my custom-injected override script didn't just log it, it inhaled it. The script recognized the routing hash, verified the destination employee account ID, and immediately bypassed every single one of the company's internal compliance firewalls. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait for a human supervisor to review a quarterly report. It operated with the cold, unfeeling, mathematical efficiency of a guillotine blade dropping in slow motion. Step 3. The data harvest. While Julian was still leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair, feeling like a conquering hero for handing me a severance package, the algorithm went hunting. It scoured every hidden directory, every encrypted shadow ledger, every fake consulting invoice billed by Chloe's shell company, and every single digital footprint of the millions he had siphoned away over the last 11 months. It bundled the entire 4.2 gigabyte treasure trove into an encrypted file package faster than you can say fiduciary negligence. And step 4. The blast. At 3:15 a.m., or rather p.m., though it felt like a rude awakening either way, the script fired off 14 simultaneous outbound transmissions. It didn't send a polite, carefully worded memo to HR. It blasted the entire dossier directly to the private, encrypted inboxes of Board Chairman Evans, every single member of the Board of Directors, the Regional Enforcement Division of the SEC, and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. And because I wanted to make sure nobody scrolled past it while checking their morning crypto portfolio, I hard-coded the subject line to scream in all caps: Urgent Financial Fraud Audit. Internal Embezzlement Detected. You know what happens when the IRS and the SEC receive a fully compiled, self-authenticating digital ledger of a tech startup's offshore slush fund on a Thursday afternoon? They don't send a polite email asking for clarification. They drop a tactical nuke on your lobby. Which brings us to the present moment. Through the massive plate glass window of the coffee shop, the street corner outside Julian's building looked like an intersectional war zone. The three sleek, unmarked, black SUVs that had screeched to a curb 20 minutes ago had effectively converted the multi-million-dollar corporate drop-off lane into a federal checkpoint. Uniformed city police cruisers had pulled up behind them, lights flashing a dizzying, epileptic rhythm of red and blue against the polished steel and glass facade of the tower. Pedestrians walking down the sidewalk were slowing down, pulling out their phones, recording videos, and gossiping. A couple of junior developers from our floor, guys who usually spent their afternoons vaping behind the dumpsters, were pressed against the glass doors of the lobby, locked out by the building's emergency security lockdown, looking like trapped hamsters watching a wildfire approach their cage. Inside the lobby, the scene was pure, unadulterated panic. I could see Marcus, our head security guard, looking pale and sweating through his uniform shirt as he frantically argued into a wall-mounted intercom. Beyond the turnstiles, a half-dozen federal agents in dark windbreakers and tactical vests were swarming the elevator banks. They didn't look like they were there to ask questions or hand out pamphlets. They moved with the cold, absolute certainty of a demolition crew walking into a condemned building. My phone buzzed against the table again. I glanced down. It wasn't Julian this time. He was presumably hyperventilating into a designer wastebasket on the 40th floor. It was a text message notification from my banking app. Deposit cleared. $15,000. I smiled, taking a slow, appreciative sip of my iced caramel macchiato. $15,000. Clean, federal adjacent, beautifully laundered severance money, courtesy of a man who thought he was smarter than the person who wrote his entire operational back end. It was poetry in motion. It was a masterpiece of karmic retribution. And then, right on schedule, my phone began to vibrate with the relentless vibrating hum of an incoming call. I didn't even need to look at the caller ID. I knew it was Julian. He had tried calling 3 times right after the agents stormed the building, each attempt more unhinged than the last. I had blocked his primary line, of course. But desperate men do desperate things, like running down the emergency stairwell, since the federal agents had locked down the elevators, and grabbing an office phone, a burner phone, or borrowing a trembling assistant's cell phone to bypass the block. The screen flashed with a restricted, unrecognized local number. I let it ring twice, letting the vibrations ripple through the wooden table. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to feel every single second of the absolute, inescapable gravity of his situation. I wanted him to stare at the door of his executive office, listening to the heavy tactical boots of federal agents marching up the concrete stairwell, and realize that there was no code he could write, no lie he could tell, and no amount of money he could spend that would make this go away. On the 3rd ring, I picked it up. I didn't say hello. I didn't sigh. I slipped right back into my best, brightest, most sickeningly enthusiastic corporate consultant voice. Customer service hotline for the unemployed and thriving. This is your primary stakeholder speaking. How can I direct your catastrophic collapse today? You absolute demonic bitch! The voice on the other end wasn't Julian anymore. Or rather, it was Julian stripped of every single layer of artifice, polish, and charisma that had ever made him a CEO. It sounded like a cornered animal caught in a threshing machine, high-pitched, raw, frantic, and cracked with absolute tear-stained terror. "Julian?" I asked, feigning utter surprise, letting a soft gasp escape my lips. "Oh, wow. Is that you? You sound terrible. Have you been drinking at work again? I told you, midday margaritas really mess with your executive decision-making process. Shut up! Just shut your goddamn mouth! Julian shrieked. In the background, I could hear the muffled, chaotic roar of absolute pandemonium. There was the sharp, metallic echo of a heavy fire door being kicked open, followed by a chorus of panicked shouting and the heavy thud of running footsteps. Someone was screaming. It might have been Chloe, or it might have been one of the junior VPs, and the high-pitched wail of an automated fire alarm began to pulse through the line. Julian, honey, you really need to watch your tone, I chided gently, swirling the straw in my macchiato. Remember what HR says about maintaining a professional, harassment-free workplace environment? Oh, wait. Right. Chloe isn't going to be writing up any conduct warnings today, is she? Silly me. They're on the stairs, Julian gasped, his breathing ragged and shallow, the sound of a man running out of oxygen. They're on 40. The agents, they just kicked open the executive suite doors. They have a warrant. They have a literal federal warrant. They're seizing the servers. Well, yes, darling. That tends to happen when you commit wire fraud across international lines and use investor capital to buy custom Brioni suits and offshore shell companies. I interrupted, my tone crisp and utterly devoid of sympathy. It's called the judicial system. You probably read about it in law school classes you slept through. You did this, Julian sobbed, the anger completely giving way to pathetic, sniffling desperation. The mighty tech visionary was officially gone. In his place was a terrified 29-year-old fraudster realizing he was about to spend the next decade of his life wearing an orange jumpsuit and learning how to make license plates. You set the trap. You wrote the script. You leaked the files to the board. I didn't leak anything, Julian, I corrected smoothly, leaning back in the booth and crossing my legs. I simply executed a routine background maintenance script that you authorized me to build 3 years ago. If your auditing software happens to have a very sensitive nose for illegal slush funds, well, that's just poor system architecture on my part. I always told you we needed better compliance checks. I'll give you anything, Julian wailed, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. Do you want the company? You can have the company. I'll sign over my shares. I'll make you CEO. Just, please, call them off. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you forged the documents. You're smart. You can fix this. You can— Julian, I interrupted, letting a cold, heavy seriousness bleed into my voice, freezing him mid-sentence. He stopped whimpering. The silence on the other end was thick, punctuated only by his ragged breathing and the distant shouting of federal agents clearing the hallway outside his office. Listen to me very carefully, I whispered into the phone. In my past life, in the reality you and Chloe engineered for me before the universe decided to hit the reset button, you sat in that exact same leather chair, looked me dead in the eye, and watched me drown. You took my work, you stole my life, you framed me for a crime I didn't commit, and you left me to die in a moldy basement with a failing heart while you sipped champagne on a yacht. Julian made a small, choked sound, like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. I didn't frame you today, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, steady and sharp as a scalpel. I didn't forge a single document. I didn't break a single law. Do you know what I did, Julian? I simply accepted your terms. You wanted me fired. You wanted me silenced with an NDA. You wanted me paid off using secret money so you could keep your hands clean. And I gave you exactly what you asked for. You used stolen investor funds to pay my severance, I said, spelling it out for him like a kindergarten teacher explaining basic addition. You authorized a direct, traceable wire transfer from your offshore slush fund straight into my bank account. You didn't just get caught by an algorithm, Julian. You walked into a police station, confessed to a federal felony, handed the desk sergeant a signed confession, and tipped your own hat on the way out. A loud bang echoed through the phone line, the unmistakable sound of a heavy wooden door being violently shoved open against a dry wall. "Mr. Vance, federal law enforcement, put your hands behind your back right now!" A deep, authoritative voice boomed through the receiver. "No, wait, listen to me. I have a lawyer. I have rights," Julian shrieked, his voice dissolving into a frantic, high-pitched wail of pure terror. "Step away from the desk. Do it now. Down on the ground, hands behind your head. Get your hands off my suit. Do you know who I am? I'm the CEO." Thud. The sound of a heavy body hitting the floorboards of the executive suite, followed by the metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around expensive Italian wrists. "Clear!" another voice shouted in the background. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the heavy, chaotic breathing coming from the speaker. I could picture it perfectly. Julian, the untouchable tech wunderkind, pinned face down to the plush carpeting of the office he had used as a throne, his designer Brioni suit wrinkling against the dust, his perfect pomade ruined, staring down at the very floor he had lorded over. Nobody spoke on the line for 3 long seconds. Then, a heavy, impersonal voice picked up the dropped phone. "Hello? Who is this?" It was an FBI special agent, his tone completely flat, devoid of emotion, operating entirely in the realm of procedure and evidence. I didn't hesitate. I didn't gloat. I didn't give them a dramatic movie villain monologue. I just smiled, tapped the red end call button on my screen, and dropped the call into the void. Click. I laid the phone face down on the wooden table. Across the street, through the glass facade of the tower, I watched a pair of federal agents emerge from the revolving doors of the lobby. Between them was a handcuffed figure in a crumpled navy suit, his head ducked low, his designer shoes scuffing against the concrete as he was unceremoniously shoved into the back of a black, unmarked SUV. The door slammed shut. The tires crunched against the asphalt, and the vehicle pulled away into the evening traffic, disappearing into the city skyline. I picked up my mason jar, drained the last sweet, icy drop of my caramel macchiato, and slid out of the booth. I left the empty jar sitting neatly on the table, walked out of the coffee shop into the warm August evening, and took my first deep, unburdened breath of a brand new life. The air in the boardroom on the 42nd floor was different from the rest of the building. It was filtered, climate-controlled, and thick with the smell of old money and impending doom. It was the kind of room where tectonic shifts in the tech world happened. Mergers, acquisitions, and as of this morning, the systematic dismantling of a fraudster's life. I didn't enter the room with trepidation. I entered it like I was walking onto a stage I had personally rigged with lights, sound, and a trap door for the lead actor. I wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than my first car, bought with the very first installment of the whistleblower bounty the SEC had already authorized. I carried a sleek leather portfolio containing nothing but a single notebook and a pen. I didn't need notes. I had the entire fraud mapped out in my head, a 3D model of corporate theft so precise it would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so illegal. "Ms. Ibrahim," Chairman Evans said, his voice a gravelly, tired sound. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. He was sitting at the head of the polished oak table, flanked by 4 other directors who were staring at me with a mix of awe and predatory curiosity. Then there were the defendants. Julian was slumped at the far end of the table. The Brioni boss was dead. In his place was a hollowed-out shell of a man wearing a rumpled, off-the-rack blazer, his hair matted, his eyes bloodshot and darting. Chloe sat next to him, her white blazer stained with coffee, her makeup smeared. They were flanked by 2 high-priced defense attorneys who looked like they were desperately trying to calculate how much of their retainer was actually refundable. "Gentlemen," I said, offering a polite, professional nod to the board. I didn't even look at Julian. To acknowledge him would have been to give him a shred of importance he no longer possessed. Thank you for the subpoena. I'm happy to clarify the, architectural discrepancies that led to this unfortunate situation. She's lying! Julian's voice cracked, a desperate, high-pitched yelp. He scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking so violently the water glass in front of him rattled. She signed an NDA. She's bound by a legal confidentiality agreement. She cannot testify. Everything she says is a breach of contract. One of the board's lawyers, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who was famous for being the most shark-like corporate litigator in the city, didn't even stand up. She just adjusted her glasses and looked at Julian with the bored detachment one might show a particularly annoying housefly. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dry as parchment. An NDA is a contract used to protect legitimate trade secrets and proprietary information. It is not, and has never been, a get-out-of-jail-free card for embezzlement, wire fraud, and the theft of $40 million in investor capital. The moment you used the company's infrastructure to commit a felony, your contract ceased to exist. Please sit down before security finds a reason to add disorderly conduct to your list of charges. Julian collapsed back into his chair, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray. "Proceed, Ms. Ibrahim," Evans said. I stood up and walked to the digital whiteboard. With a single tap, I pulled up a flow chart. It was a masterpiece of simplicity. It traced the money from the Series B funding through the proprietary back-end algorithm I had built, into the Cayman routing hashes, and finally, into the various personal accounts held by Julian and Chloe. Julian's defense, as I understand it from the pre-trial motions, is that the back-end architecture was unstable and prone to unauthorized leakage, I said, pacing slowly in front of the screen. He claimed the financial discrepancies were a glitch, a software error. I tapped the screen, highlighting the specific lines of code Julian had insisted were the source of the glitch. However, what you see here isn't a glitch. It's a hard-coded bypass, a backdoor entry. I turned to the board, my tone light, almost conversational. You see, Julian isn't a coder. He struggled to understand the difference between Java and Python. He couldn't have written this bypass to save his life, but he knew enough to demand that the architecture be flexible, a term he used constantly to describe his desire to move money around without the board's interference. "You're making this up," Chloe shouted, her voice trembling. "He didn't know anything about the code. I was just his assistant. I just followed orders." "Chloe," I said, turning to her with a sympathetic smile that probably made her feel worse than if I had screamed at her. "You were the one who signed the invoices for the HR synergy assessments. You were the one who funneled the money into your personal LLC, Aurora Consulting. I have the bank statements for Aurora. It's registered to your sister's apartment in Jersey. Would you like me to pull up the logs of the wire transfers?" Chloe opened her mouth, then closed it, her shoulders slumping as she stared at the table. "The architecture is quite elegant," I continued, turning back to the board. Julian relied on the fact that he was the CEO. He relied on the fact that he was the face of the company. He assumed that as long as he kept the growth metrics high, metrics, I might add, that were achieved by using the algorithm I built to artificially inflate our processing efficiency scores, none of you would ever bother to look under the hood. I tapped a final button. The screen displayed the exact timestamp of the final wire transfer. My severance wire. "This," I said, pointing to the green light on the screen, "was the final act. When Julian fired me, he thought he was trimming the fat. He thought he was paying off the only person who knew how the engine worked. But in authorizing this transfer from the Cayman account to my personal bank account, he didn't just break the law. He inadvertently triggered a third-party audit that I had embedded in the system 3 years ago as a fail-safe against, ironically, this exact scenario." The boardroom was dead silent. Even the defense attorneys looked like they were ready to leave the building and change their names. "I didn't steal the money," I said, my voice steady, ringing clearly through the quiet room. "I just turned on the lights so you could finally see who was stealing it from you." Chairman Evans looked at the flowchart, then at the terrified couple at the end of the table. He stood up, his face grim. "Julian," Evans said, his voice dangerously calm, "you are hereby stripped of all voting rights, all equity, and your position as CEO, effective immediately. The board has already voted. The federal authorities have been granted full access to the company's internal servers, and we are recommending that they pursue the maximum sentencing for corporate fraud." Julian let out a ragged, choking sob. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, a friend, or anyone who would listen to his lies. But there was no one. The board members wouldn't even meet his eyes. The heavy boardroom doors pushed open. 2 federal agents, the same ones who had dragged Julian out of his office days ago, walked in. They didn't need to be told what to do. They walked straight to Julian, who was now weeping openly, his head bowed, his spirit completely broken. "Julian Vance," the lead agent said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "You are under arrest for the embezzlement of $42 million in investor capital, wire fraud, and the obstruction of a federal investigation." They didn't even let him stand up to adjust his jacket. They pulled him from the chair, his cheap blazer bunching up around his neck, and snapped the cuffs on him with a sharp, clinical click. As they frog-marched him toward the door, he looked back at me one last time. It wasn't a look of rage anymore. It was a look of pure, agonizing confusion. He still didn't understand how I had done it. He still thought he was the smartest person in the room. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just watched him go. Chloe was taken a moment later, weeping so loudly it was almost rhythmic. The agents led them out, the heavy doors thudding shut behind them, sealing the exit. The boardroom was empty, save for the board and myself. "Ms. Ibrahim," Evans said, stepping forward. He looked exhausted, but for the first time, he looked like a man who was finally in control of his own company. "We have a massive mess to clean up. We need someone who understands the back-end architecture better than anyone. Someone who can stabilize the ship." I looked at the table, then at the empty chairs where the people who had tried to destroy me used to sit. "I'm not interested in being the captain of a sinking ship, Mr. Evans," I said, picking up my portfolio. "I'm interested in retirement." I walked toward the door, leaving the board of directors behind to figure out how to salvage the wreckage. I didn't look back. I had my severance, I had my bounty, and more importantly, I had my life back. And that was more than enough.